Every year, the Living History Forum awards the Per Anger Prize on behalf of the Swedish government to a person who has shown great courage to promote democracy and humanitarian efforts without any thought of personal benefit. Since the uprising against the dictatorship began in Syria in 2011, Abdullah has been a strong voice in the peaceful protest for democracy and human rights. We have dearly wished for him to be here today with us. There has been diplomatic efforts to have a safe exit for him from Syria, to be here with us and to receive the prize. Unfortunately, up until now, it has failed. His life is under constant threat by the regime and also by the Daesh, ISIS. He has avoided 2 attempts of kidnapping and was seriously wounded in a failed assassination attempt this summer. Salim Salamah, who is on the panel here, will talk a little bit more about his situation. The war in Syria has been going on for over 5 years now and created the largest humanitarian crisis in modern time. And the urgency has increased for delivering some measure of justice to the victims of atrocities, even some limited accountability during conflict. So the panel that we have today will discuss the problem of impunity regarding the conflict in Syria and the possibilities to prosecute allegations of mass atrocities in international courts as well as in national courts, such as in Sweden. But also possible problems inherent with taking measures against crimes committed, such as the process not being seen as impartial and not being able to deliver justice for the most serious crimes committed by high-level officials, high-ranking military, etc. But also practical problems with witness accounts, etc. We will hear about the possibility to pursue justice while the conflict is ongoing, as well as possible post-conflict measures. But even if Syria is on the agenda and in the media every day, we don't presume that we are all familiar with the history of the conflict or its current dynamics. So we will start by listening to 2 experts on this issue that also has their background in Syria. Hanin Shakrah, on your left-hand side there. She's a lawyer, journalist, born in Yarmouk, outside of Damascus. Yeah. And Salim Salamah, Syrian-Palestinian blogger, activist, researcher, political refugee in Sweden since 4 years.
Almost.
Yeah. And then we will listen to Ola Engdahl, associate professor at the International Law Center at the Swedish National Defense College, and also a legal expert in court regarding public international law. Hanna Lemoine, prosecutor at the International Prosecution Authority in Stockholm, and the one leading a case against the Syrian national that was convicted in a Swedish court for war crimes recently. And then finally, Mikael Baaz, associate professor in peace and conflict studies and a senior lecturer in international law at Gothenburg University. Please also present yourself in more detail if you wish so. We start with you,
Hanin. Hi, my name is Hanin. I'm born in Syria. I came to Sweden when I was 4. It feels a little bit weird talking about the reasons for the current uprising, since my parents came for the same political reasons 30-something years ago. I'm a law student, I'm not a lawyer yet, and I've worked for Swedish TV on a program called Fosterland that sort of touched upon some of the issues of why people were fleeing Syria. I'm born in Yarmouk, same as Salim, and to give some brief history on the Syrian modern political history, and I give this lecture for people on a daily basis, so I'm super bad with years. But Syria used to be a part of the Ottoman Empire up until 1916, when the Sykes-Picot Agreement that drew up the lines of the Middle East and Northern Africa along the colonial interests of France and Britain. And Syria's political history has been one of military coups, one after the other. From 1949, when the first US-sponsored coup, and then up until the point of the Ba'ath Party takeover in 1963. And from 1963, there has been a security state that's built up. And has anyone been to Syria? Raise your hands. A few of you guys. Yeah, sure. So for those of you who have never lived in a security state, I hope you never have to. But what that means is that you're constantly under surveillance. There are military laws preventing you from speaking or making a point of your political views. As long as you're okay with that, as long as you don't question or make public your own views, you're fine. As long as you also are not related to or neighbors with or happen to have the same name as someone who challenges that security state. So from 1963, when the Ba'ath Party takes over in Syria, and then 1970, when Hafez al-Assad, the daddy of the current dictator of Syria, takes over, Syria has everything from a constitutional ban on oppositional parties that don't support the Ba'ath Party being in power in Syria. So there's something called Article 8 in the Syrian constitution saying you can have any political party you want as long as that political party supports Ba'ath Party being in charge of Syria. So if you're against Article 8 of the Syrian constitution, then basically you're against the constitution, and so on. So that security state builds up political courts. You don't get afforded a fair trial if, for instance, you're caught with flyers of an oppositional nature. And so for those of us who were raised in Syria, this is the state that we were born into, and this is the state that was norm up until 2011. What happens when Hafez al-Assad dies in 2000 is that his son inherits power in this socialist republic. And from 2000, there was a hope that Syria would somehow lessen its grip on its citizens. There was a hope that there would be an opportunity for the Syrian opposition to grow, for something called the Damascus Spring, and other oppositional initiatives, and all of them were beaten down. People were arrested, disappeared, exiled. This happens up until 2010, 2011, when the Arab Spring starts. I guess this is the sort of backdrop, and for those of you who know a lot more about Syria, I'm sorry for this super brief backdrop. But this is the state that we're in. From 2011, everything that we used to know about Syria and how things work is cancelled, because the uprising brings with it a whole other reality for Syria. And this is what we're going to be talking about now. Thank you.
Thank you, Hanin. It's a great honor to have you here. Thank you for coming, taking the time. Thanks for the esteemed panel as well, and ICJ, of course. This event is in the context of a very celebration of a very dear friend and very courage man, Abdullah Khateeb, who's not with us, unfortunately, as May said, and who's just now recovering from the second failed assassination attack. I can imagine that there are a lot of questions today in the minds of everybody about Syria, and there is a lot of confusion as well, which is very normal in the context of the excessive violence that we are witnessing today, not only from the regime against the people, but also from, last but not least, the Russian regime against the Syrian people. Russia, since a couple of weeks, has been non-stop bombarding the north of Syria. More than 250,000 human beings are under siege with the risk of being starved to death. Of course, bombardment has been an integral daily routine in our life since as early as 2012. With recent escalation, of course, which were denounced by the Security Council or by some members in the Security Council and by the United Nations Secretary General, with some accusations looming in the horizon of Russia committing war crimes, which of course the case of the Syrian regime since years, with the chemical weapons and everything. So for my part, I wanted this to be as generic as possible, and then I would love also to hear what your thoughts, how Syria is being portrayed for you, what sort of questions are today in the minds of the Swedish public, because this is also part of our message as human rights activists, as political activists. Usually they ask how you combine being a human rights activist and a political activist. I tell them when they were shooting at me, they were very political. So when I will be an activist, I will be very political as well. I was born and raised in Yarmouk camp, the very same place where Hanin was born and raised, to a Palestinian father and a Syrian mother. But women in Syria cannot grant their nationality to their kids. So I was raised as a stateless refugee in Syria. All I do for Syria, but still I don't have the nationality of Syria. I was a law student until 2011, when I saw that my classmates are being dragged and arrested from within the campus. We would be doing international law exam, and ironically, the intelligence services would walk into the room and drag somebody from their neck, and we would never see them again. So at that moment, I decided that also I want to, for security reasons, but also for the principle, I won't be a student at Damascus University anymore when many parts of Syria were under the bombs. It was a very active choice, and today I'm a student in the migration program, undergraduate migration program at Malmö University. I remember very vividly the first days of the revolution. As Hanin said, the death of Hafiz Assad in 2000 brought a lot of hope. I was 11 years old and I cried my eyes out when he died, because I was, like millions of Syrians, feeling like, oh, wow, now this is the end of Syria. Hafiz Assad is dead. Like, what are we going to do now? And this is how we were brought up. I mean, he's the father of the nation, he's the founder of the nation, and with his death, we are all lost. At Damascus Spring in 2001, I was 12 years old. I remember some of my family members were active in Damascus Spring, and I remember how hopeful everybody was, and how naive everybody was with Bashar. The blue-eyed doctor educated in England was more brutal than his father, because this was not only about Assad, this was about a mafia regime composed of multi-ethnic backgrounds. It's not about the Alawite minority. I'm half Alawite, my mother is Alawite, so it's not about us being Alawites against the Sunnis, or this is about multi-ethnic regime or multi-ethnic mafia controlling the nation, and this marriage between military and the businessmen resulted in what we are living today. In the framework of my work with the Palestinian League for Human Rights, the organization I represent, we work exclusively on the Palestinians of Syria, and that's because there is 500,000 stateless Palestinian refugees in Syria, and facing their secondary forced displacement. Being stateless and having to cross borders is two things that you cannot combine in one sentence. They make your life hell. Basically, nobody wants you because you're highly politicized, protracted refugee status in the Middle East. We've been working on a lot of cases, a lot of issues. starvation, which took place in southern Damascus and led to the death of more than 200 people. The Syrian regime has been besieging southern Damascus since 2013, and as a result of the siege, at least 200 died in Yarmouk because of lack of food and medical supplies. And so we contributed to Amnesty investigation in documenting the casualties of the siege. We've also worked on documenting the use of water as a tool of war in Yarmouk camp for Palestinian refugees, and forced disappearance of Palestinian refugees in Syria. So those three thematic reports we worked on. But mostly as a small and voluntary organization, we work today, because we work on voluntary basis, we work today mostly on lobbying and advocacy in the context of, very legally, in the context of bridging the protection gap Palestinians endure in between the mandates of the different UN agencies, UNHCR and UNRWA. We're considered refugees under UNRWA, which means that we have no access to international protection as defined by either resettlement or local integration or repatriation. So we work pretty much in documenting cases of Palestinians being deported back from different Arab countries back to Syria, which is of course a violation of the 1951 Convention of Refugees. And we work with different groups to avoid this tragic destiny, because if you're deported to Syria, most probably you're going to be killed. When we were discussing the panel, and I would like to end with this point, because I would love also to hear your thoughts. When we were discussing this panel, I was talking to May, and because I'm familiar with a little bit the legal debate that's going on in Sweden today, we were discussing the notion of justice from abroad. Justice from abroad in the sense that today you have a big Syrian community living in Sweden, and within this community you have people who are pro-regime, people who are anti-regime, people who do not identify with either. But you also have a very youthful diaspora. There is 40,000 Syrian young men and women under the age of 35 in Sweden who arrived after the revolution. So it is a youthful diaspora. And this means that those people are going, in a way or another, contribute to the reconstruction of their country. They are going to be an integral and an important part in the Swedish society because of their young age. How those people are going to interact with other Syrians, what sort of dynamics this diaspora has, especially that there is a contestation over history, there is a contestation over whose fault is this, there is a contestation of you are a murderer, no, you are a murderer, and we are part of this debate when it is brought before the Swedish justice, you see, especially when the recent case of the FSA fighter was brought before the justice, and then when another case of a fighter with the 4th Brigade was released, the 4th Brigade, which is very famous for its bloodshed and involvement in many massacres in Syria, was released for lack of, I think, witnesses or evidences. So we're part of this discussion inside the diaspora, inside the community, and there are a lot of dynamics which we can explore later on during our discussion. Thank you.
Okay, yes, thank you. And thank you very much for inviting me. I've been asked to address two questions. The possibility to prosecute crimes committed on the territory of Syria in international fora, and also the possibility to intervene with military means to halt atrocities and protection against human rights abuses on the territory of Syria. So these are two quite large subjects, and I have 10 minutes, so this will be quite a brief overview, but I'll be happy to answer any questions afterwards. So the first topic then, the obvious starting point will be the International Criminal Court. And the ICC has jurisdiction over the most serious crimes. Crimes of such character that all states also have the possibility to exercise jurisdiction by whoever has committed them and wherever they have been committed. And these are the crimes of genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. But the jurisdiction of the ICC is based on the principle of complementarity, meaning that it has only jurisdiction if states are unable or unwilling to prosecute themselves. The idea is to build a safety net, you can say, where those not prosecuted by states could be prosecuted by the ICC instead. Another threshold for jurisdiction of the ICC is that it's limited to crimes committed on the territory of a member state to the ICC, or by a national of a member state to the ICC. Syria is not a member of the ICC. However, many of the foreign fighters, so-called foreign fighters, are nationals of states that are members of the ICC, so they could be prosecuted, perhaps, if states that could prosecute them are unable or unwilling to do so. However, in this respect, the Office of the Prosecutor of the ICC has said that this summer, actually, that they have insufficient allegation against citizens of member states to go forward with investigations. And this is based primarily on the focus of the ICC, to focus on those most responsible of serious crimes. And according to the Office of the Prosecutor, ISIS in particular is an organization that is primarily led by nationals of Syria and Iraq, and neither of these states are members of the ICC. Another venue would be the powers of the Security Council in this respect. The Council may refer the Syrian conflict to the ICC, which it did with the Libyan conflict in 2011, and Libya was not a member of the ICC, so that would be an option. And this venue was actually suggested by the UN-appointed Commission of Inquiry already in February 2013. But so far, both Russia and China has vetoed this possibility. So this blocked a referral by the Security Council to the ICC. So if nothing changes in the near future, the ICC would not seem to be a viable option to prosecute crimes on the territory of Syria right now. Therefore, the UN Commission of Inquiry now has asked for the establishment of a special tribunal for Syria instead. But this sounds good, but it's not as easy as it sounds, perhaps, because it could either be based on a resolution by the Security Council, which was the case in the former Yugoslavia and in Rwanda. And we have Hans Corell here, who was drafting the statute of the ICTY. And Lennart Aspegren, who was a judge at the Special Tribunal in Rwanda, who I'm sure could answer any questions relating to those courts or tribunals. But since we have a veto, states exercises their veto power, Russia and China, this option would not seem to be viable either, I would say. The other option would be a consent of the Syrian government, which would not seem to be forthcoming either. So what is left is actually national prosecutions of international crimes. And since these are crimes of a universal character, that any state has the jurisdiction to prosecute crimes, I think this is the way forward, and we will hear more about that from the Swedish experience later, I think. So, leaving that aside, the other topic would then be the possibility to intervene with military means, and what is the legal basis in international law to do that. Again, of course, the Security Council could take a decision that the situation in Syria is a threat to international peace and security, and decide on the use of force, which one could think would be a good thing, since 4 of the 5 permanent members are already acting on the territory of Syria. But this has not been a possibility as of yet. The other possibility, to use force at least, but perhaps for another reason, would be the right of self-defense, when a state is subject to armed attack, which we could say at least Iraq would be in this case. But they are not really subject to an armed attack by Syria, but rather from the territory of Syria. And there is no special link. The link that is required between the state and armed group is missing. It's actually on the opposite. They are trying to fight ISIS, of course, to Syria. So other arguments is now developed to support the right of self-defense. The fact that Syria is unwilling or unable to suppress the acts of ISIS against Iraq, or the fact that Syria is not in effective control over parts of the territory. These are not, as of yet, I would say, part of Lex Lata, the law as it stands today, but could perhaps be arguments that could be used in the future. Consent would be another option, of course. Russia is basing their military operations on the consent of the Syrian government. Consent is a legal basis in international law. What is questionable is when to give consent when the government is involved in civil war. And at least in older days, this was not prohibited. It would not be a possibility to follow an invitation from another state if the state asking for help would be involved in civil war. But today I would say that state practice is moving to another direction, supporting also the possibility of inviting states to help out also in civil war. So that would be a possibility. Another, lastly, would be responsibility to protect. Responsibility to protect is not as of yet part of international law or a firm legal basis in international law, but the concept developed after the Kosovo intervention in 1999, the NATO-led intervention. And the concept aims to provide a legal basis to intervene with military means when the Security Council is blocked and when there be no other available option to protect against atrocities. So the concept in the part that is most interesting from an international point of view is that it would be possible to circumvent the Security Council and other group of states perhaps could decide to intervene. But this part of the concept has not been supported by states afterwards. When the leaders of the world was meeting in 2005, this was rejected, this possibility, and the responsibility to protect has largely been a political concept, being with the possibility to push the Security Council to act, as it did in Libya in 2011, with the, you might say, a responsibility to protect kind of concept, where the purpose was to protect civilians. So this is, as of yet, not part of international law. The UK has another view. They say that they have the right, they have argued that they have a right of humanitarian intervention, basing that act on 3 criteria, where they say when there are convincing evidence of extreme humanitarian distress of a large scale requiring immediate and urgent relief. There should be no alternative to the use of force, but the use of force also must be necessary and proportionate to the aim of the operation. This was claimed when it was obvious that it was chemical weapons was used in Syria. But the UK Parliament said no to intervene, but this was the explanation of the UK government. So it would seem to be difficult to find a legal ground that is based in law as it stands today in Syria. But we may also see that other grounds are used and states are not really that forthcoming in protesting. So what we might see is actually a changing in the making of international law when it comes to the prohibition of the use of force and possible new grounds. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, and thank you so much for being here, and it's been so interesting to listen to my co-panelists. I'm going to talk a bit about the Swedish experience and what we do in Sweden to fight impunity in Syria. As mentioned, I'm working as a prosecutor at the International Prosecution Office in Stockholm. We're about 40 prosecutors working with international crimes and organized crimes. As Ola was mentioning, crimes against humanity, war crimes and genocide are core international crimes that we have universal jurisdiction over. That means that no matter what these crimes are committed, me and my colleagues in Sweden and the police can investigate and prosecute whenever we have evidence, and also that we also need a decision from the government before doing that. But as a basis, we have universal jurisdiction. as we see it, we also have an international obligation to investigate and try these cases if we cannot extradite the person or surrender the person to, for example, ICC or an international tribunal. The basis for us is to fight impunity, and that's important. We don't take side in conflicts, or it's not a political procedure we have. What we do is we fight impunity. In Sweden, we have for quite some time realized that this is important. It takes a lot of resources to investigate crimes like this, and if it would just end up at any prosecutor's pile of other work or a police officer's other pile of work, it might be forgotten, because these are difficult crimes to investigate, and you need to work consistently on them for there to be results. So already in, I think it was 2008, there was a war crimes unit set up within the police and within the prosecution office where I work. Specific prosecutors were asked to work specifically on these cases. And since about 2 years, we're 8 prosecutors working with war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide in the Stockholm office. We do some other work, but at the moment that's what occupies our days the most. Historically, we've had convictions regarding genocide in Rwanda. We've had convictions regarding war crimes in former Yugoslavia, and we've had one, as mentioned before, one conviction which is now appealed to the Supreme Court, a conviction of war crime in Syria. And if we talk about Syria to start with, as you all know, there are a lot of grave breaches going on of the Geneva Conventions in Syria today. What we can see on the news are horrific reports on what is going on. It's so much that you want to send a message that you have to obey the rule of law, obviously here in Sweden, but the laws of war, for there to be some kind of safeguard for example, civilians. When we investigate cases relating to Syria, it's, to begin with, it's sort of normal police and prosecutor work. We need evidence, just as in a murder or a torture case, or a torture-like case, I should say, because we don't have torture as such in Sweden. But it's normal work. We need the evidence of some sort. We need witnesses, and we don't have a possibility to hear anonymous witnesses in Sweden, as you do, for example, in international tribunals. But we need witnesses to come forward to give their testimonies to us. There are other ways also to investigate crimes committed in Syria, because, as I said, there's a lot of grave breaches going on. There are so many atrocities, and there are also evidence of it. There's evidence coming from activists taking documents or other evidence out of Syria. There are also perpetrators that themselves document the crimes and maybe publish it on social media or somewhere else. So there are a lot of evidence coming out of Syria. For us now, it's obviously a no-go zone. We can't go to the conflict as such, so of course it's difficult to investigate, but there are some possibilities to investigate. And that's what led us to the case where an FSA fighter was convicted in the appeals court for war crimes. It was an act of torture-like assault. He had filmed, or someone had video recorded this assault of a man tied to a chair, and we got information on the identity of one of the men in the film torturing this man. And this man was residing in Sweden, and he was arrested, and has been a long process during trial due to the fact that we didn't know who the victim was, and we decided not to take too much action to try to find him due to security reasons. We didn't know where he was and in what situation he was, if he was alive. And when we were about to start the case in the appeals court, the victim was, or an interview was published in a newspaper where it turned out that the victim was residing in Turkey. This led us to halt the process and asked Turkey to interview this man. And later on we had to redo the process in the district court with the victim present to tell his story. In the summer the case was in the appeals court, and the FSI fighter was convicted to 8 years imprisonment for grave assault and for crime against international law, or you can explain it, you can see it as war crimes. And as I said, that's now appealed to the Supreme Court. And this was based on a video recording that the man himself had published on his Facebook. So as a police or a prosecutor point of view, this is sort of an easy case, because we have, as I saw it, we had all the evidence we needed on the video recording. Because it's a video, you can see what happens. You had 5 minutes of a torture-like assault. When we had the interview with the victim, it turned out it wasn't only these 5 minutes, it was 5 days. So that meant that we also indicted the FSA fighter for these, not 5 days, but 4 days, because we were told that he was present for 4 days. But sometimes the evidence of a video recording is enough. And that was the case in this case, as we saw it. Of course, having the victim there also enhanced the case, and it lay better ground for the court to be able to find a judgment. I know there's been a discussion in the Syrian diaspora, and Salim was mentioning it. Why do we prosecute an FSA fighter for this assault when we know what the regime is doing? To me, the answer is simple. Because I am under an obligation to prosecute whenever I have enough evidence. And in this case, I had. And this was a core, to my point of view, a core international crime. And I prosecute when I have that. We don't take political considerations when we prosecute. When we think back to this, and sometimes when I talk about this, one lesson learned is maybe that it's naive of us to think that this will not send a political signal, or some people might interpret it as a political judgment. Maybe we should have been better in communicating what I think is obvious, that we fight impunity. That's it. And I would be very interested to hear Salim's point of view, what we should have done, and how to communicate this in the future. Because what we want, of course, is that we want witnesses to come forward, because I'm sure there are a lot of people living in Sweden that can give us great testimonies that would be important for cases that are not as easy as a video recorded assault. If we want to prosecute in the future high-ranking officers or anyone on a higher level on either side, we need people to come and talk to us. We need the linkage witnesses, etc. So I think it's important to also for us to send the message that we fight impunity, and to explain that also, so that people might want to come forward and give testimonies to us. So basically, just to sum up, what we do is we try to send the message that we're fighting impunity. If you commit a war crime or another core international crime, we can and we will prosecute if we have enough evidence here in Sweden. Thank you.
Thank you, Mikael.
Thank you very much. I have got the task to add perspectives that have not been mentioned by the other panelists. And that's a bit of a challenge, considering the interesting presentations that we have heard. So the question is, where should one start if one want to add a fresh perspective on this? Well, we could start by saying that the situation in Syria is bad. There is consensus regarding that. Then you could start to make it more problematic, namely to ask the question which I wrote down for myself here when I was listening to the other panelists. And that would be, who are committing what crimes against whom in Syria? Then we are immediately entering into a much more delicate situation. I think it could be argued that according to the information that we have, is that the Syrian government, various opposition groups, etc., they are all committing actions that would quite easily qualify as crimes against humanity and war crimes. But again, who are committing what crimes against who? And then I was also looking on the leaflet, and the question I asked is actually here: who are committing war crimes in Syria? And by extension, what possibilities do we have to prosecute people who have committed or are suspected to have committed various war crimes? Well, I mean, if we sum up what has been said in the panel, there are really, really good options. There is only one thing lacking, and that is the political will to do so. And the key in this regard seems to be the UN Security Council. Because, as you said, well, under Chapter 7 in the UN Charter, it would be quite possible to launch a humanitarian intervention to stop what is going on in Syria. There will also be a possibility to use the International Criminal Law track if the Security Council decides to take action and prosecute or ask the ICC to prosecute various individuals. So you could act against the states that are participating in the conflict, and you can act against the individuals. And we have a very, I would say, coherent framework for doing so. And we also have, as you said, and which you are working with, various domestic means to do so. If we just for a second leave the domestic possibilities aside, then what is the problem? Well, the problem is the political will to do so. Because we have 5 permanent members in the Security Council, and they are not in agreement. We have on the one hand the US, the UK and France, and they are sometimes in agreement, but not in total. And then we have on the other hand Russia and China. Sometimes they are in agreement with one another, but not always. And they are very seldom, at least in the case of Syria, in agreement with the other 3 countries. And as international law is designed, well, then the 5 permanent members, they have a veto, so they can stop everything. But that is not a legal problem, that is a political problem. Saying this, I would like to emphasize the close connection between law and politics on the international level. As long as the discussions are carried out regarding what could be done, how could a Security Council be drafted, and so on and so forth, then we are talking about international politics. If a resolution is adopted, then we are talking about international law. However, there is of course not such a clear-cut case in practice. So, if we look upon the humanitarian intervention track, well, what could be done is that you act according to the responsibility to protect without a consent, and then you can act by taking the question, the Syrian question, away from the Security Council and ask the General Assembly to say something wise about this. if they are willing to support or not support a humanitarian intervention. That has been done before under what was known as Uniting for Peace. That would not make it legal, but it would for sure make it more legitimate. So that will be one future option. Then if we look upon the other track, the international criminal law track, well, what could be done then? Well, as we have already said, but it is worth emphasizing, well, if the Security Council decides to act under Chapter 7, then they can direct this to the ICC, and the ICC can act regardless of the fact that Syria, well, they have signed the ICC's conventions, but they have not ratified it. So that would not be something that will stop action. That is, however, as the situation looks like currently, not something that looks very possible. Then there was some mentioning about establishing some kind of special tribunal. And we have a number of special tribunals around the world. There is one, for example, in Cambodia that I have been working with, studying it over a couple of years. And that is a court that is a mix between the national and the international, using Cambodian law, international law, Cambodian prosecutors, judges, defense lawyers, as well as international ones. And that is not something that the UN Security Council have decided should be there. That is rather a result of a negotiation between the UN and the Cambodian government. Then you have to ask yourself, what is it that you put in place when you establish this kind of special court? How will it function? And so on and so forth. And that is, from my perspective, not so impossible as it might sound when you look upon it on the surface. Because the situation in Cambodia was not less difficult than the situation in Syria today, where you had a number of conflicting, what we could call internal parties, but you also had foreign states participating in one way or another. That time it was Vietnam, it was the Soviet Union, it was France, it was the UK, the US, and so on and so forth. The only thing that was needed was a regime change, so that the old government, the Khmer Rouge, they were toppled. And then they were replaced by a new government. And then it took 79, 89, say some 25 to 30 years of negotiations. Then there was a special tribunal in place. And that special tribunal is working now. Then, of course, you have to ask yourself, do you want to have this kind of creation once again? Especially if you want to achieve justice, if you want to end impunity, and so on and so forth. Because establishing these courts is difficult, but they are even more difficult to guide and to direct, because, and that would be my final remark before we open up the floor, returning to you. You said that we do not take political considerations when we decide to prosecute or not. That is something that you definitely do when you are talking about international criminal law. Thank you.
Can we make some just very brief comments before we open
Yes,
the floor? Or no, please go ahead.
Yeah. Yes, I want you to make comments on each other's talks, but first I would like to, because I know that we have a prominent guest there, Hans Corell,
Yes, I have
and
to
you have to
leave.
leave. You can introduce yourself.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm Hans Corell, the former legal counsel of the United Nations, and I was involved in the establishment of all the existing international criminal tribunals there are. But I just want to clarify one thing, and it concerns Syria and Kofi Annan. He was the first representative of UN in the League, Arab League. And I can tell you that he was extremely concerned. We had worked, he and I and others, in Kenya for several years. And there we managed to get the parties to the negotiation table to conclude an agreement, and it ended up forming a grand coalition that governed the country for 5 years. So when he got this task, we were sitting here at my apartment in Stockholm in April 2012, and he was asking, do you think we can work in Syria in the same way as we worked in Kenya? And then he fell silent, and then he said, no, Hans, it won't work. I do not have the support of the Security Council, which is absolute prerequisite to succeed. I'm going to leave this task, which he did in August the same year. So it's so tragic, and I agree here what was said about the Security Council. In my analyses today, I always seem to end up among the permanent 5 members in the Security Council. It is absolutely unforgivable that they behave in the manner they do. And now this time it is Russia, of course, even maybe committing war crimes in Syria. But in 2003 it was, of course, the UK and the US that shot off the war in Iraq in flagrant violation of the UN Charter. In my view, that was a seed to ISIS, that conflict. Could I just then said Cambodia? When I negotiated Cambodia agreement, I was very, very troubled. And as you know, Kofi Annan withdrew from the negotiations because we lost confidence. And I'm firm in my opinion that Cambodia should never, ever be a model for any future accord. If so, the Sierra Leone exercise is much better, but that requires the consent of the government in Syria. And if the number one is one of the suspects, there will not be an agreement. And I met Fatou Bensouda in Nuremberg a few days ago, the prosecutor of the ICC, and she is working on it. But as you said, someone here, that these are not the big fish. They don't have evidence for them. And then finally, with respect to the prosecutor, here I'm very determined. The prosecutor should not take political considerations. If the prosecutor is authorized by the Security Council or under a national law to prosecute, the prosecutor must follow the evidence and then prosecute. Political considerations is something else. And if the ICC is involved, there is actually a provision, I think it's Article 16, which allows the Council to stay the hand of the prosecutor for political reasons. Maybe it would be worse if the prosecutor proceeds. But it's very important that when the prosecutor is working, the prosecutor should follow the evidence. Thank you for listening to me, and forgive me for leaving, but I have another commitment, so I simply have to leave. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hans. I just want to make, I don't know how well informed the audience is, but you mentioned FSA. I don't know if everybody, like Free Syrian Army, maybe you said. Yeah, I mean, I want to give, if any of you have comments of what the other...
Yeah, just very, very brief comments for some bottom lines. I think I totally agree about the fact that we need to talk protection of civilians, and this has been, in Syria there will be no end for the bloodshed until external actors stop the indiscriminate killings of civilians. And today we know who is killing who. In terms of, the mass killing, protection is the first step for a political solution. This is the bottom line, and this is what we as Syrian civil society is demanding today. We just terminated a very long advocacy trip in New York and in Washington, and we've been telling UN Security Council member states, UN General Assembly member states, and the American government that if we don't have a no-bomb zone, then the number of the deaths, which stands today at around 500,000, according to our estimates as civil society, the number might double. Simply, if the killing continues as it is now. And why we are calling for a no-bomb zone? Because apparently in the international politics, and as you said, protection has been always political. It has been always a political question. When 1951 Refugee Convention was drafted, politics were in the middle of the drafting process, and it has been always, and it will be always there. So no-bomb zone because In Syria, we have a crisis of red lines. The international community always warned the Syrian regime that if you bomb civilians, we are going to take actions for you. The regime bombs. If you gas civilians, we are going to take actions for you. The regime used chemical weapons, 1,500 are killed, and nobody is doing anything. So the threat of using power used its value in the eyes of the regime and in the eyes of the opposition and in the eyes of everybody. So when we say also, now back to what Hanna was talking about, I absolutely think that whenever evidence exists, we need to bring people before justice. And this is our bottom line as also human rights groups and people involved in human rights. So it's absolutely not about convicting those and not convicting those. But within the community arises the question that the fighter of the Assad army in the 4th Brigade was photographed standing over dead bodies. And the photos were leaked to the Swedish media. So the question is, and this is because maybe we are not well informed in terms of the procedures in Sweden, and because it was communicated in that way, the question remains, wasn't that enough to at least take further steps, you know? And then for the average person who did not go to law school, you know, this is a very big question that might not make them go to bed at night, and will definitely, if they are aware of war crimes or if they were subjected to war crime, will definitely make them not come forward. Especially when we talk about the absence of anonymity in witnessing in Sweden, and especially that repression across border. This is the title of a research paper at Uppsala University, talking about how the Syrian regime has been extremely active in Sweden. Repression across border is extremely scary for Syrians, because if I come forward and I have extended family in Syria, everybody is going to be terminated. You know, so this is also an internal legislative question, of course, for Sweden to answer, having this massive diaspora today in Sweden. So it's like when opposition is bombarding civilian areas under the control of the regime, we condemn that, absolutely. As rights groups, we condemn that. We condemn killing. But at the same time, I think the way the message is getting across to the community is very, very important, not only for people to feel safe to come forward, but for this diaspora future in this community, I think. And of course, how we should communicate, and those are questions that absolutely worth investigating further.
Do you want to comment on that? Because is there a discussion also at the amongst you among prosecutors, more of a pedagogical problem of explaining that the role that you have and that you're impartial, and maybe at the same time you can also say something about the possibility of witness protection, and one more thing also, and how most of the cases are initiated. Who is reporting the crimes? Is it the migration agency or is it private persons in Sweden? Yes.
To start with, to comment on Salim, what you said. First of all, regarding the man that was under arrest for a few weeks in the beginning of the year, we have not commented what photo that related to. We have said that the basis for the suspicions was a photo that had been in social media, but if we talk general about a photo, because we do get some photos, and that's to respond to your question, we get the investigations. They start either from input from migration agency here in Sweden that has an obligation to report so if they have suspicions of crimes against humanity, war crimes or genocide. So they do report cases to us. But there are also private persons, more and more, that come to us, mainly with intelligence. They give us anonymous tips. I think you could say that we can see an increase of that after the indictment of the person that was the FSA, the guy who belonged to the FSI. But what we get then is quite often photos. Yeah. And if we have a photo that might be in some way incriminating, but it might not be that the photo in itself shows a crime. A video recording, yes, of course, can show a crime, but if you have a photo, it's not necessary that that will show a crime committed. You can suspect there's a crime committed, but we need to know exactly, we have to establish when and where the photo was taken and under what circumstances. And then it's not enough with intelligence. We need hard facts. We need witnesses or something that we can make so we can analyze the photo when and where it was taken, for example. And then, of course, we can also rely on reports stemming out from Syria that NGOs, etc., have done, or the Commission of Inquiry, for example. But we have to establish when and where. On the other hand, I can also mention that we, a month ago, so indicted a person belonging either to the Iraqi regime or a militia affiliated with the regime for war crime, in that we claim that he has committed war crime by degrading a dead human body. For example, we have a photo of him with a head in a bowl, and he has other photos as well with him posing next to dead bodies. And we argue that this is an international crime. We have convictions for similar behavior in Finland and Germany, and these are recent judgments. And we now will try the Swedish legislation to see, which I think is the case, that this is also, according to Swedish law, a war crime. And that will be tried in November. So that will be very interesting. So sometimes a photo might be enough, but otherwise we need the hard facts to be able to prosecute. And then we of course need witnesses. And what do we do? What can we do with witness protection? Yes, we do have Swedish police have a witness protection program, but that obviously functions in Sweden. And it's quite often that if you live in Sweden and you're originally from Syria, you have relatives in Syria, and we cannot protect, as it is today, the relatives in Syria. And as I said, unfortunately, we don't have anonymous witnesses in Sweden. You have that in some Nordic countries and you have it in international tribunals, but we do not have that in Sweden, at the moment at least. So yes, we do have witness protection, but we can protect in Sweden. And also we have, yes?
No, okay. I mean, also just one point also, can you say something about, because there's a UN Commission of Inquiry in Syria that has produced a witness, but have you tried to gain access to those witness accounts?
Yeah, absolutely. In the first case that we've been talking about, I contacted the Commission of Inquiry because I could read in one of their reports that they had similar video recordings. So I wanted to discuss with them whether they had this video recording to see if they could tell me when and where. In that case, they couldn't help me with that, but I relied a lot on their reports or their fact findings to establish that it was an armed conflict going on at the time. And I could also, they also did a report on, this is very specific, but bombardments in Al-Hafa, which is a small town in the Latakia region, because it was interesting for us to know when this bombardment happened and if there had been a bombardment before that, just to establish when this happened. The Commission of Inquiry, as we discussed here, they are of course also aware of that a referral of Syria to the ICC is not foreseeable in the near future. So I know that there's a discussion going on, or they think about what shall we do with all this information? Could we share it with others? And actually, as of today and tomorrow, two of my colleagues are in Geneva to discuss this, and we will try to explain to them why we need this information and how we hope that the Commission of Inquiries for Syria or other commissions can actually help us. And I think it was because we actually have had a Syrian case that they invited Sweden to discuss this with the High Commissioner. because even if there would be a tribunal or a court in the future, they won't be able to take all the cases. So if we really want to fight impunity, it's also up to us prosecutors in Sweden and in Europe to do these cases. Yeah.
Is there anybody else that want to comment on what has been said? Yes, Hanin.
I didn't mention this, but I happened to be in Syria in 2011 when the uprising started. And for various reasons, one of the things I was working on was meeting with people from various opposition groups who had been in opposition to the regime way before 2011, and people who had been imprisoned, sometimes put in front of a judge, not always, people who have been disappeared. One of the best sports of the Syrian regime historically was to use security courts, disappearances, torture as a means of controlling the larger population. So one of the things that Syria has been excelling in is actually documenting its own war crimes, long before 2011. And there have been reports, pictures coming out of Syria that were documented by the regime itself to show how the sort of systematic torture is working, how the prisons are disappearing people, starving people to death, and so on. So, as a Syrian, as someone who is interested in human rights, I can feel shocked by how the law prevents that kind of peace process or reconciliation of the Syrian population by showing what actions are allowed and what actions are outlawed from the point of the international community. When you say it takes, maybe, inshallah, in 30 years, we can start talking about some sort of reconciliation or transitional process, that outrages me as a journalist and so on, but also from an educational point where I can go out to any Swedish village and meet people who tell me this and that person that we met in this migration facility belongs to this or that group, or I'm afraid of speaking my mind because I know that this person has contacts in Syria that could harm my... So even from a Swedish security perspective, this becomes a problem directly or indirectly. For instance, I've had people confront family members of mine in Syria based on things I've said in Sweden. So at some point, this is not just a problem that concerns what's happening in Syria. At some point, it also becomes a problem for us nationally, as a community, as a society, as, peace-loving Swedes or whatever.
Any more comments that you want to make in the panel? Or, yeah, I want to let in the audience also. Let's see if I can...
Hello, my name is David Monk. I am active in the Föreningen Syrien Sverige, where we work, Swedish and Syrian and other people together, for raising awareness about Syria. I very much agree with what you said about it's important that we here in Sweden care about what happened in Syria when you have such big exile community here. I'm also an alumni writer for the magazine Ljusbäraren for Stockholm's law student, also read by professional lawyers, and I will write something about this. And I have one question. However, I'm no expert in international law, but some of you really are, so then I have a good opportunity to ask you questions. The principle of jus cogens, I remember from when I learned international law, jus cogens, can that be applicable to the crimes of Bashar al-Assad and against his regime?
Yes, thank you. Yes, jus cogens norms are the norms which are of special importance norms that you cannot deviate from. And some of the crimes, like genocide, the prohibition of genocide, is usually looked upon as just Kogen's norms, like crimes against humanity and some war crimes as well. So yes, I agree with you, but the problem remains to find a fora or a basis for intervention, military intervention. But there are violations of just Kogen's norms in Syria today.
Well, my very brief reflection would be what I said earlier. Yes, of course, if there is political will. Otherwise, no. It is as simple as that from my perspective, unfortunately. But that would apply. But the problem is not to find the proper charges, the proper prosecutions, but actually to make it happen.
I do.
Yes. Was there any more questions right now?
Or comments?
Yeah, or comments? No.
Until 8, huh? You're staying here.
Actually, because Hanna, you have to leave at 7:30, right? Yeah. That's, I think. But yeah, a question down there.
Hello, my name is Yusser, and I was born in Yemen, as you told. And I would like to hear from you guys. I'm sure, you have been asked, you are Palestinian, and if we compare how Palestinians have been treated in other countries, comparing with Syria, we have been treated very, very well. So, what would be your answer when you are asked why you are included in the political issues in Syria? And I would like to hear from you, Salim. What role Palestinians are doing right now in Syrian crisis?
Sure.
Can I say something? One of the dilemmas that I feel has arisen actually in the past 2 years, because in the beginning a lot of people were saying it is unwise for Palestinians who have been treated fairly okay up until a certain point. And I explain this by explaining that the Syrian regime opened up an umbrella for anyone who doesn't intervene or contradict the policies of the regime. As long as you are silent, you're under the umbrella. And as soon as you step out and criticize, the umbrella is gone. And so you become a direct enemy of the state. And so for Palestinians or other minorities, because when I'm going around Sweden, I meet a lot of people who say, but this minority was protected under Bashar al-Assad, or this minority, and so the divide and conquer perspective is really important, that if one of us is subjected to torture and the rest of us are silent, then we're all complicit in that crime. So for me as a Palestinian, even before 2011, the condition of silence for that protection makes the protection invalid. And as when the revolution started, Palestinians were not a separate part. But for Palestinians to say, as long as we stay out of the conflict, we're protected, or for Christians or for any minority in Syria, that means that the protection is conditioned, and any conditioned protection can go away just like that. So I think it's a prerequisite for any group to not be silent when they see crimes being perpetuated against their neighbors or friends or allies, political allies. And I know that even coming to Sweden, this becomes a problem because you can have parallel narratives on what's happening in Syria between brothers, between family members, between neighbors. And as soon as the transitional process in Syria starts where we're seeking justice on a national level or an international level, that's fine. But as long as we have the regime still in place, this process of healing can't start. And that's why I think it's important to not just, I mean, I can be on a bus in Sweden and hear some Swedish guy sitting and telling his friend that the only viable solution in Syria is for the regime to remain. And that means that Hanna and you guys aren't doing your jobs properly, because if people still think that that's an option, then the healing process in Syria can start. I'm not doing my job either, obviously, but you know, so it's a problem both for minorities in Syria and in the region, because it says to people that it's okay to behave like this as long as you're still in power. As long as you can remain in power, you can treat your subjects as badly as you want. As soon as you're out of power, you become a Gaddafi or a Mubarak, then the justice process can start. I think that's a very bad pedagogical example to give to war criminals or potential war criminals in the world.
Very, very briefly, thank you for the question. And indeed, it has been asked extensively within the Palestinian community. And first of all, just to be also the bottom line about this, Palestinians were treated very well by the Syrian people and not the Syrian regime. The law in which we were given the same rights as Syrians, except political rights, which Syrians do not have anyway, was in the 50s. And it was because of the will of the Syrian people. So this is very, very important point of departure. Secondly, there is your question is multifolded. It's a question about identity, mostly what is the Palestinian Syrian identity today, and where do we stand in vis-a-vis Syria? And our positions in the Palestinian community in Syria is as diverse as the positions of Syrians themselves. So there is no one position. Why I decided, for instance, to be politically engaged. I was born and raised in Syria. Syria is my homeland. I am from Palestinian origin, but I'm Syrian. I'm born to a Syrian mother. And I've seen my friends being killed in Syria. So the clinical separation and categorization between a Palestinian and a Syrian is very, very wrong, I think. Because you cannot classify identities in that way. There are many Palestinians who contributed to the besiege of Yarmouk and contributed to the starvation of 200 people. And there are many Palestinians who contributed to building the vibrant civil society landscape in Syria because of our previous political experience as refugees and as political agents. So it is, I think it is a multifolded question. The argument of why Palestinians intervened and they should not have been intervened has been used extensively by the regime to also, as Hanin said, to divide and conquer. And by the way, interestingly and ironically, we were the first group to be accused by the Syrian regime to instigate violence in Syria. Palestinians were the scapegoat in the first couple of months, which people later on realized that it was baseless. So it's a very interesting question, and now in the diaspora, especially in Sweden, we are into this introspective process of what does it mean to be a Palestinian Syrian, because it's not about being only Palestinian or about being Syrian.
Thank you. More questions. Start here.
My name is Erik Pettersson, and I wonder what other countries are prosecuting war crimes made in Syria, or perhaps where other countries where many Syrian refugees now reside.
We gather more questions and then you can ask them.
My name is Karin Ambich. I am a junior judge at the District Court of Södertörn. And my question is for Ms. Lemoine, so I'm happy that I got the chance to ask it before she has to leave. Just out of curiosity, I guess, you touched upon the case being tried in November. Would you please disclose what court that case is being tried at? And also, are there other cases regarding war crimes in Syria that are sort of, so to speak, in the pipeline in Swedish courts?
I have a question. You referred to this as a Syrian crisis, and I was a little bit curious about what you think about calling it an American crisis or a Russian crisis, and also what kind of international law can put pressure on the 5 countries who are actually could have the political will or the power to find a solution.
Yes, who wants to start?
First question, are there other European countries that have prosecuted related to war crimes in Syria? First of all, I would say that we do have a great cooperation between the European states. Quite a few other countries, like for example Germany, Holland and France, they have special units like we do regarding war crimes. And we actually met last week in The Hague, where we often meet to discuss Syria and other conflicts and what is going on. Apart from the Finnish case in Syria with the beheaded person with a photo, and the German case relating to the same behavior, I'm not sure that there has been any prosecutions or convictions regarding war crimes in Syria. Quite a few, however, convictions that has been framed or labeled terror crimes. There have been some cases of that in Europe. It depends also on how you look upon this, and I can also mention there has been a conviction in a Swedish court also for the crime of terror. You might know that case. It was about a year ago, I think, that the judgment came. It was a video recording once again where you could see people being beheaded, and there were two Swedes in that photo, and they were convicted for this. And that was labeled a terror crime. They were, however, also alternatively or secondly charged for war crimes, but the court convicted them for crimes of terror. The case that will be tried with the beheaded or the posing, it's Blekinge tingsrätt that will have that case, but it will take place in Malmö I think in November. If there are any other cases going on, obviously I don't comment on cases that are secret, but there is one man in pre-trial detention for suspected of some crimes committed in Syria. It's not my case, but I think there will be a prosecution or indictment this fall in that case. I would guess. Yes.
So I can say a few words about the last question, and say the law is there. Really, there are so many possibilities to act through the Security Council, for instance, and for other states to act. But it's the political will that lacks. But the law is giving the opportunities to act. But it must be someone that has that will to do it as well.
Well, I just wanted to add, and that's also on the last question, that, it's quite hard to use legal means against someone who has the veto power. However, you could always circumvent it and establish some kind of other semi-legal pressure, and then the way to go would be via the General Assembly. I mean, strictly legally speaking, that would not be legal, but it would be something that could create a basis of legitimacy close to being legal. I mean, if we take just as a very, very simple example, that the General Assembly issue a resolution saying that the Security Council is not taking their responsibility. That would be something creating a certain pressure, however, it would not be legal.
May I say something? Yeah, sure. There are other legal arguments floating around it, which I also told in my presentation. And I can really see the need of states want to do something. That there is no clear legal basis, but states want to do something anyway. And one can see that. But the problem is in the longer perspective. If we have new and additional exceptions to the prohibition on the use of force, these might be used in different ways in the future. So it might also need to be clear on the fact that it's good to have a prohibition on the use of force with few exceptions. Even though we would like to have other exceptions in this particular conflict, but that could be abused in the future in other types of conflicts. So one need to have that in mind as well.
Yeah, just saying a few words on the creative use of law. There is, for example, the UN Security Council Resolution 2249 that you could look upon if you're interested, because that is something which is quite ambiguous, and it could be interpreted in a number of ways, and that is perhaps the strongest legal answer that could be provided for the time being. I don't have the time or the possibility to really dig into that resolution 2249, but from a legal perspective, it's quite interesting, and it's also quite interesting from the perspective on what is taking place on the ground in Syria.
The last question about Katarina's question about whether this is a Syrian crisis or an American crisis. I think this is, first and foremost, this is a crisis of leadership in the international arena. Politically speaking, I think this is a serious crisis of leadership and willingness of the international community. But also it's a crisis of instruments for Syrians, seeing that nothing can protect them. And nothing can stop the bloodshed, although Syria is the most documented conflict in the history of modern conflicts. You know, millions of hours of recorded video. So I think we never, as civil society, we never say this is a Syrian crisis or a Syrian civil war. It's not. See how many are bombarding ISIS, leaving Assad to bombard us. So I think this is accurately this is a proxy war, I would say, if names are important at this stage.
I just wanted, because I mean, you briefly mentioned just that there is regarding the desperate situation of and now, I mean, we're all aware of what is happening in Aleppo, and there has been initiatives of, and can you just briefly talk about the no-fly zone and the non-bomb zone?
The no-bomb zone, which we have been trying to advance on the agenda of many member states and Western countries. And the no-bomb zone idea came because of the hesitance to discuss publicly, also to discuss a no-fly zone. A no-bomb zone is comes to say that nobody is allowed to bombard civilians. Now I'm going to oversimplify. Nobody is going to bombard civilians, and if civilians are bombarded, then we are going to reiterate, we are going to bomb you back. So if the Syrian regime bombards civilians, then there will be a setting or a group of countries which will bombard an airport or bombard a specific location as a retaliation for the bombardment of civilian areas. This is very, very simply speaking. And the no-bomb zone is something that the Hillary Clinton campaign is very committed to. As you know, there is an American elections now going on with Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, the entertainment of the season. And of course, we don't know yet the outcome of the elections, but we know that the American inaction and the American hesitance in the context of Syria resulted in the Russia having the upper hand, resulted in the imbalance that we are witnessing today, and the horrific massacres that are taking place. So no-bomb zone comes in reply to that. I think it's a desperate attempt from us as civil society to say that we need to do something. Is it? Are we being naive? I don't think so. I think there is a lot of willing to help, but I think we were trapped as Syrians in a very hostile international political climate, and we are paying very, very high price for the battles of others. We will see if the no-bomb zone goes forward.
No comments on that, because there was a question, and we're soon to be finished, but Hanna has allowed us to continue a little bit more.
My name is Lars Gunnar Larsson, and when it comes to the political will, of course, this is kind of linked to some kind of, I think, the need for some kind of peace movement that would sort of put pressure on the members of the Security Council. And the question is, what's the main, the point number one, sort of, in a movement like this? And no bomb zone is, of course, or no fly zone and things like that are things that could be discussed. What I see as a problem, the complexity of this conflict, that we also have the ISIS problem, right? If there was only a conflict between Assad and the opposition, it would be easier. But both the United States and Russia are eager to continue to the bombardment of the ISIS city. So would one sort of claim that we should stop all fighting in Syria, including the fight against ISIS, or try to sort of include ISIS in some kind of peace treatment, to sort of end the violence. How do you see those perspectives?
That could be a good final question to map up the way forward, your reflections. Anyone?
I think the basis must be protection of civilians. And I don't see ISIS as being the problem at all. I know for a lot of people outside, they have a huge... ISIS is like the boogeyman. The problem has been there from day one, which is you don't want to be betting on the wrong horse, so to speak. And this is, I mean, what Mikael and Ola and Hanna and Salim have been talking about is all of these countries are waiting for the race to be finished to know which horse won the race, and then we can start talking about prosecuting and making tribunals and so on. And in the meantime, Syrians are being killed, and ISIS is not at all the main problem. 9 out of 10 deaths in Syria are caused by the regime or allies to the regime. So don't obscure this. Any movement building on anything else than protecting civilians is bound to fail. And I think that should be the main focus of the international community, if we still have one, to protect civilians, whatever side of the border that they're on, whatever side of regime or opposition controlled or whatever. Protecting civilians is what needs to happen, and then transition and justice and so on. We can talk about that later when the fighting and killing stops.
Well, I mean, I think I could only add, I mean, of course there are a number of legal dimensions on what is going on in Syria at the moment. The question is, however, if the major problems at the moment are legal or if they are political, and I would bet on that they are actually political.
I think Hanin covered this very well, and as Mike said, this is pretty much political. It's 100% political, and as we said, protection has been political since the beginning of time. Who to protect and who to shelter and who to give asylum status. These are all political questions. So we hope we have nothing but hope.
Yes. So we want to thank you. We want to also for being here, the panel today. Thank you very much. We have a small gift from the ICJ to bring with you. No, it's just something to eat.
Thank you all for coming.